high in the mist-covered highlands of Scotland, legend and history intertwine. To many, Macbeth is a name carved in shadow, a ruthless murderer, a tyrant, a king undone by his own ambition. This image, etched forever in the words of Shakespeare, has shaped the way the world remembers him. But behind the quill of the playwright lies another truth, the truth of a real king, a warrior who fought to unite his fractured land, a ruler who brought order to chaos, and a man whose reign was far different from the villain painted upon the stage. Tonight, we travel back nearly 1,000 years, to uncover the life, the battles, and the legacy of the real Macbeth, the Scottish king behind the legend. Look closely at the Scotland of the 11th century, a wild, unforgiving, and breathtaking. The highlands stretched endlessly, shrouded in mist, as though nature itself kept secrets hidden among the peaks. But behind the beauty lay turbulence. Here, the landscape was not just scenery, it was a battlefield, every valley a hiding place, every fortress a symbol of dominance. In this age, Scotland was not one kingdom, but a patchwork of rival clans, each carving their identity into the land with sword and blood. The storms that rolled across the mountains were mirrors of the storms in men's hearts, for every sunrise brought with it the possibility of betrayal, battle, and death. This was the cradle of Macbeth's world, a land both majestic and merciless. Scotland's true power lay not in its kings but in its clans. These warriors were fierce, bound by blood and tradition, but divided by endless rivalry. They fought for their chiefs, for their families, for honor carved into steel. Loyalty was everything, yet it was fragile, crumbling when ambition whispered louder than kinship. To live as a warrior meant to rise each day with death as a companion, for battles came as often as the rain. When the horn sounded across the valleys, men tightened their grips on shield and spear, ready to defend their pride. For them, war was not just survival, it was identity. In this crucible of violence, young men like Macbeth learned the brutal truth, that greatness was won not by words, but by the blood spilled upon the soil. To wear the crown of Scotland was not a blessing, but a curse. Kings did not sit on thrones of peace, they sat on thrones carved from fear. In the smoky halls of power, every noble's smile was edged with suspicion, every gesture a mask concealing ambition. A feast could become a death trap, a toast could be the final drink of a doomed ruler. Kingship here was fragile, for the throne was never secure, yet it was a seat that demanded constant vigilance. Betrayal was not an exception, it was the rule. In such a world, trust was more dangerous than any blade. And yet, despite the peril, men still craved the crown, blinded by the promise of glory, even as it often became their grave. Within council halls, politics was no less bloody than the battlefield. Rival lords gathered to debate the kingdom's fate, but behind every word lingered hidden agendas. Voices rose like clashing swords, accusations filled the air, and every decision became a contest of power. These gatherings were not places of unity, but arenas where men tested each other's strength without drawing blades. Yet violence was never far more than one council ended with spilled blood instead of signed treaties. In this realm, words could cut deeper than steel, and alliances could crumble in the flicker of torchlight. It was within such councils that the seeds of rebellion were sown, whispers of overthrow passed in shadows, and plots began to take shape, plots that would one day pull Macbeth into their deadly tide. Scotland's destiny was always written in blood. Beyond the halls of power lay the battlefield, where the clash of swords echoed louder than any decree. Men fought and fell in the mud, banners trampled, shields splintered, and life poured out onto the earth like rain. The air was thick with smoke, screams, and the cries of crows who circled above, waiting to feast on the fallen. Here, kings were made and unmade not by votes or councils, but by strength, cunning, and the will to survive. It was in such fields of death that the story of Macbeth would truly begin, for in a land where power was won only at the edge of a blade, one man's destiny was rising, a destiny that would forever blur the line between history and legend. Macbeth was born around the year 1005, into a world where survival was uncertain from the very first breath. His early years were spent among the rugged highlands, where the wind carried both lullabies and warnings. His mother cradled him in a world of hardship, where even noble children were raised in the shadow of violence. For young Macbeth, Tales of ancestors were not bedtime stories but lessons of survival. His blood carried the legacy of kingship through his mother's line, tying him to Scotland's royal house. From the start, fate whispered that this child was more than ordinary. In the flicker of firelight and the echo of clan chants, the seeds of ambition were planted. Scotland would not simply be his homeland, it would be his destiny. From boyhood, Macbeth's path was forged in iron. He was trained not only in the ways of honor but in the brutal art of survival. Each dawn saw him in the yard, wooden sword in hand, as he learned to parry, strike, and endure the sting of defeat. He studied the blade as if it were an extension of his own will, while his teachers reminded him that a warrior's greatest weapon was his mind. Leadership was hammered into him alongside combat, for to command in Scotland meant to inspire fear and loyalty in equal measure. While others played in the meadows, Macbeth learned how to stand tall among men who would one day follow him into the storm of battle. The boy was quickly vanishing, and in his place, a warrior began to emerge. Though not born directly to a king, Macbeth carried royal blood through his mother, a granddaughter of Kenneth II. In a kingdom where lineage was power, this bloodline gave him a claim though distant to the throne itself. He was no mere warrior, he was a man marked by ancestry. Yet in Scotland, noble birth was a double-edged sword. It offered opportunity but also painted a target on one's back. Rivals eyed such bloodlines with suspicion, knowing that ambition could easily awaken in them. For Macbeth, the knowledge of his heritage was not simply pride, it was fuel. He grew with the awareness that destiny was within reach, if only he had the courage and cunning to seize it. The crown was not his yet, but it gleamed faintly in the horizon of his future. The day soon came when training turned into reality. Still young, Macbeth was thrust into battle, where the clash of steel and the cries of the dying drowned out any childhood that remained in him. His armor hung heavy, his sword shook in his grasp, but he fought with the desperation of one who knew there was no turning back. The mud swallowed the fallen, and blood stained his hands for the first time, yet instead of breaking him, the battlefield hardened him. He learned that courage was not the absence of fear but the will to fight despite it. In the smoke of that battle, he was no longer merely a boy of noble blood, he was a warrior in his own right, forged by fire and fear into someone Scotland would one day remember. With each skirmish, Macbeth's skill and courage grew. His name began to travel beyond his clan, carried on the lips of warriors and lords alike. In halls of stone and timber, men spoke of his valor, and whispers followed him like shadows, whispers of a young man who might rise higher than any had imagined. Around feasting fires, he was praised as both fierce and cunning, a rare balance in a land that devoured the reckless and the timid alike. Yet Macbeth remained quiet, watching, listening, measuring those around him. He was learning the art of patience, for he knew greatness did not come to those who reached too quickly. His time would come. The crown was still distant, but step by step, reputation by reputation, Macbeth was moving closer to the place fate had carved for him. By the time Macbeth reached manhood, he was no longer simply another warrior in the shield wall, he was the man at the front, sword raised high, voice echoing above the thunder of war. His men followed him not because they had to, but because he inspired them to believe they could win. Every strike of his blade carried not just strength but certainty, and in a land plagued by endless conflict, certainty was more precious than gold. As the mist rolled across the battlefield, men shouted his name, for to march under Macbeth's banner was to march with courage itself. And slowly, victory by victory, the young warrior was transforming into a general whose reputation grew like fire sweeping across dry grass. Scotland's enemies came not only from within but from across the seas. Viking raiders struck the coasts like storms, their longships spilling fire and death. It was in these brutal encounters that Macbeth proved himself a true defender of his land. With shield in hand and voice of command, he turned chaos into order, rallying men who might otherwise have fled. The clash of axes, the spray of seawater, the roar of flame, as if these were the sounds of his youth. When the longships finally burned, it was said that Macbeth had not only saved lives but secured Scotland's honor. His victories carved his name into the memory of the clans, a reminder that he was no longer just fighting for himself, but for a nation that needed a leader of iron. Warriors win battles, but generals win wars. And soon, Macbeth was trusted not only with a sword but with strategy itself. In smoky war tents, his voice guided men older than him, his finger tracing lines on maps that determined the fate of kingdoms. He understood that war was not only blood and steel, it was calculation, patience, and knowing when not to strike. His counsel was valued by kings, his loyalty noted by nobles. To be a general in Scotland was to balance on a knife's edge. Serve too well, and you threatened your master; fail, and you lost your life. Yet Macbeth walked that line with uncanny skill. The warrior had become the strategist, and his influence began to stretch beyond the battlefield. But with power came rivals. In Scotland, no victory went uncontested, no reputation unchallenged. Other lords whispered in corners, suspicious of Macbeth's growing fame. Some saw him as a useful ally, others as a dangerous threat. Macbeth, however, learned the value of silence. While others argued, he listened. While others shouted their ambitions, he studied the weakness in their voices. In this world, battles were not only fought with blade as if they were fought with patience, with words, and with the sharpness of a mind willing to wait for the perfect moment. In the great halls of power, Macbeth was already playing the game that would one day lead him to a throne. By the time his name spread across Scotland, Macbeth was no longer simply a warrior, nor even just a general. He was becoming something greater, a figure of legend, whispered about in both taverns and courts. His victories against traitors, his brilliance and strategy, his unshakable courage on the field, these were the stones upon which his legend was built. Yet, with every triumph, the shadow of destiny grew longer. Men cheered for him, yes, but others feared him. The crown of Scotland still rested on another's head, but in the hearts of many, Macbeth had already begun to look like a king. And in that moment, beneath the weight of blood, fire, and ambition, the path to kingship began to unfold. King Duncan was Scotland's ruler, but his throne rested on fragile ground. Though noble in heart, he lacked the strength to bind the kingdom's rival clans into unity. Rebellion sparked like wildfire, and the crown seemed more a burden than a prize. For warriors like Macbeth, loyal yet ambitious, it was clear, Scotland needed not only a king, it needed a commander. Each failed campaign, each murmur of doubt among the nobles, chipped away at Duncan's authority. And in those cracks of weakness, ambition began to find its roots. The throne, though still occupied, no longer seemed untouchable. In the shadows of the royal halls, ambition found its most dangerous ally, Lady Macbeth. Fierce, cunning, and unafraid, she whispered into her husband's ear the very thoughts he dared not speak aloud. She reminded him of his victories, of his strength, of the crown that seemed within reach. "You are not made to serve," she urged. "You are made to rule." Between them grew a bond of fiery, his skill with the sword and her unyielding will. Together, they began to dream of a Scotland reshaped, not under Duncan's wavering hand, but under Macbeth's iron command. And what began as a whisper soon turned into resolve. At feasts, where laughter and music filled the smoky halls, danger was never far away. Nobles toasted to the king with smiling lips but calculating minds. Macbeth sat among them, the firelight dancing across his face, his thoughts no longer of feasts or songs but of power. Every clink of the goblet, every glance across the table, reminded him that the crown was within arm's reach if he dared to take it. And as Duncan celebrated victories not truly his own, Macbeth weighed the cost of silence. The feast was a mask of joy, but beneath it, the kingdom trembled with unrest, and destiny whispered his name. Ambition does not come without torment. Macbeth stood beneath the cold moonlight, the wind of the Highland staring at his cloak. His mind raged with doubt. Loyalty to Duncan bound him, yet the vision of kingship haunted him. Could he betray the man he had fought beside? Could he stain his honor with blood? The night stretched long, and in its silence he faced the truth: Scotland would not change under Duncan. And so, the warrior made a choice that would alter the course of history. From that moment forward, Macbeth was no longer Duncan's loyal general. He was the shadow of a rival king, waiting to strike. The path to the throne was paved not with honor, but with blood. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth knew this, and yet they did not waver. In a torch-lit chamber, they bound themselves to a single destiny. She gave him the fire to silence his fear, he gave her the strength to carry their ambition. Together, They resolved that Duncan's reign must end, and Scotland would soon have a new king. The crown was no longer a dream, it was a plan, and though the night was still, its silence carried the weight of approaching thunder. For in that moment, the fate of Scotland itself was sealed. The night of destiny arrived cloaked in silence. King Duncan's castle, usually alive with the sounds of guards and servants, seemed strangely hushed, as if the very stones knew what was about to unfold. Torches flickered weakly, their light swallowed by the shadows. Within those halls, guests slept without suspicion, never knowing that betrayal was creeping ever closer. For Macbeth, every step echoed louder than thunder, every breath felt like a confession. Yet the silence did not stop him, it carried him forward. Tonight, Scotland's fate was being rewritten, not in council halls or battlefields, but in whispers and shadows. Before the act, the warrior wrestled with himself. Macbeth's heart pounded like a war drum, his thoughts torn between loyalty and desire. Duncan was not merely a king, he was kin, a guest under Macbeth's own roof. To kill him was to betray not only a monarch, but the sacred code of honor. Yet ambition spoke louder than conscience, whispering of power, of destiny, of a crown that would not wait forever. Macbeth stared at the dagger before him, the blade glinting in the faint light, as though daring him to take it. And in his torment, he realized the truth that there was no turning back. The crown demanded blood. Before the act, the warrior wrestled with himself. Macbeth's heart pounded like a war drum, his thoughts torn between loyalty and desire. Duncan was not merely a king, he was kin, a guest under Macbeth's own roof. To kill him was to betray not only a monarch, but the sacred code of honor. Yet ambition spoke louder than conscience, whispering of power, of destiny, of a crown that would not wait forever. Macbeth stared at the dagger before him, the blade glinting in the faint light, as though daring him to take it. And in his torment, he realized the truth that there was no turning back. The crown demanded blood. Then came the moment that would change history. Duncan lay in his chamber, heavy with sleep, unaware of the blade hovering above him. Macbeth's breath trembled, his hand slick with sweat as he lifted the dagger. For a heartbeat, time froze at the weight of betrayal pressing harder than the steel itself. And then, with a thrust, silence was shattered. Duncan's life ebbed away in the very house of the man sworn to protect him. The dagger dripped not just with blood, but with the death of loyalty, of kinship, of trust. Scotland had lost its king, but gained something far darker, the reign of ambition born in shadow. When the deed was done, silence roared louder than battle. Macbeth stood pale, haunted by what he had done, while Lady Macbeth seized the moment, urging him to wash his hands and bury the evidence. The dagger was stained, but the path was clear, the crown would be theirs. Yet even in that moment of triumph, shadows crept closer, for though Duncan was gone, his blood would not vanish, it would linger in whispers, in suspicion, in guilt. Macbeth had taken the throne in blood, and though the crown might rest upon his head, it would never sit lightly. The warrior had become a king, but at a price his soul could scarcely bear. Macbeth was crowned at Scone, the ancient seat of Scotland's kings. The nobles bowed, their voices ringing with forced loyalty as the crown was lowered onto his head. Lady Macbeth stood tall, her eyes blazing with triumph, as if the kingdom itself had bent before her will. Yet even in that moment of glory, the throne seemed carved from stone and shadow, as though it bore the weight of every sin that had earned it. For though Scotland had a new king, whispers stirred among the clans. Some celebrated a warrior's rise, others murmured of betrayal. The crown glittered, but beneath its gold, it burned. The king's court was no longer a place of counsel, it was a theater of suspicion. Every noble who entered Macbeth's presence was greeted with a smile that masked fear. Murmurs lingered in the corners, questions unspoken but heavy. Did Macbeth truly earn his crown? Was Duncan's death more than fate? The whispers gnawed at him like a wolf at the bone, and soon, every loyal subject seemed a potential traitor. To Macbeth, the throne felt less like a seat of power and more like a fortress under siege. The sword had won him the crown, but paranoia now ruled his heart. Of all the whispers that haunted Macbeth, one rose above the rest. To Banquo, the prophecy of the witches had promised Macbeth the throne, but to Banquo's line, it had promised kings forever. Macbeth's crown burned with the thought, he had killed Duncan only to wear it briefly, while Banquo's descendants would inherit Scotland. Fear turned into rage, and friendship into danger. Banquo had once been Macbeth's brother in arms, but now his very existence threatened the throne. And so, under the cover of mist and secrecy, assassins rode with orders sealed in blood. Macbeth's crown was no longer defended by honor, but by murder. In triumph, Macbeth held a feast to display his power. The hall glowed with torchlight, the tables heavy with meat and wine, yet beneath the cheer lay unease. Then, as Macbeth raised his goblet, his face turned ashen. Before him, in his very chair, sat Banquo's ghost, pale, bloodied, silent. None but Macbeth could see it, yet his horror betrayed him. He raved, he shouted, he cursed at the empty air, leaving nobles whispering in dread. Lady Macbeth forced laughter, her smile a shield against suspicion, but the damage was done. Fear had become visible. The throne was no longer merely fragile, it was haunted. From that night on, Macbeth's rule was one of iron and terror. He no longer trusted the loyalty of men, so he ruled through fear. Soldiers enforced his will, and the sword became his crown's true symbol. To challenge Macbeth was death, and to praise him was survival. Yet for all his power, he found no peace. The crown weighed heavier by the day, and the faces of the dead rose in his dreams. Lady Macbeth, once his fiercest ally, began to falter beneath the burden of guilt. And so, the king who had seized Scotland by blood found himself a prisoner not of enemies, but of fear itself. Desperate for certainty, Macbeth returned to the very voices that had set his path to the witches. Beneath a storm-lit sky, their chants filled the night, smoke curling from their cauldron. Beware Macduff, they warned, but also whispered of promises. None born of a woman shall harm Macbeth, and he shall not fall until Birnamwood comes to Dunsinane. Their words poured like fire into his veins, half comfort, half curse, for Macbeth heard what he wished, invincibility. He left the witches with a heart of steel, never seeing the trap within their riddles. Fate had spoken, but fate always speaks in puzzles. But even as Macbeth clung to prophecy, Lady Macbeth unraveled. Once the flame of his ambition, she was now consumed by the fire of guilt. In sleepless nights, she wandered the halls, her eyes hollow, her hands forever scrubbing at blood that was no longer there. The whispers that had once strengthened Macbeth now tore her mind apart. Out, damned spot, she murmured, lost in her torment. Her strength had carried them to the crown, but her spirit could not endure its weight. Soon, Scotland mourned its queen, not with tears, but with silence, for she had died alone, broken by shadows no one could chase away. While madness claimed the queen, rebellion rose in the land. Malcolm, Duncan's son, gathered allies, and Macduff, his heart burning with vengeance, marched at his side. As they advanced on Dunsinane, the prophecy stirred. Soldiers cut branches from Birnam Wood, carrying them as cover, and from afar it seemed the very forest was on the move. News reached Macbeth, and for the first time, his heart faltered. The witch's words echo: "To Birnam Wood shall come to Dunsinane." Fate was no longer distant, it was at his gates. The battle roared, a storm of steel and fire. Macbeth, the warrior king, fought with the ferocity of 10 men. Bloodied but unbroken, he carved his way through foes, declaring he could not be slain by any born of woman. But then came Macduff. The two clashed, steel ringing louder than thunder. Macbeth laughed at prophecy's promise, yet Macduff's reply struck deeper than his blade. I was from my mother's womb untimely ripped, not born of woman. The prophecy cracked, and with it, Macbeth's shield of destiny. In that moment, fear finally found him, and as steel met flesh, the tyrant's reign ended. Macbeth fell not as a coward, but as a warrior who had gambled against fate. His crown slipped from his brow, lying in the mud beside him, while the sun rose over Scotland reborn. Malcolm was hailed king, and the land began to heal. Yet Macbeth's shadow lingered. History would call him tyrant, murderer, usurper. But a legend would make him something more, the tragic king who believed in destiny, and was undone by it. In the centuries to come, Shakespeare would immortalize him, turning the Scottish warrior into a tale of ambition, guilt, and downfall. Macbeth the man had died, but Macbeth the legend had just begun. And so ends the tale of Macbeth, not merely the tyrant of Shakespeare's quill, but a king of flesh and blood, a man who ruled Scotland for 17 years with strength, ambition, and at times, cruelty. His rise was carved by fate, his fall sealed by prophecy, yet his story lives far beyond his death. In life, he was a warrior king, caught between loyalty and ambition. In death, he became legend, immortalized as a warning and a tragedy. The Highlands still whisper his name, carrying his story across the centuries. Macbeth, the man, the myth, the king of forever remembered, forever reborn in history's shadows.